So, a vexing question of the day. Is the United States a democracy or a republic? Well, apparently, CNN just ran a segment highlighting voters speaking about our country being a republic and not a democracy. And this seemed to elicit grave concern from CNN. The words democracy and democratic do not appear in our Constitution. Republic and Republican do. Well, because we have some democratic institutions as part of a republic, this confuses people. Voting on some things doesn't make us a democracy. If I put pickles on my hamburger, I eat vegetables, but it does not make me a vegetarian. For something to be democratic, people vote on it. Conversely, a republic is run by rules and systems. The rules-based system is run by elected and appointed officials who have powers designated by the rules and the systems. Now, our founding fathers and constitutional drafters were very well versed in classical history of the Greeks and Romans. They had an incredible distaste for democracy and would not deliberately create one under any circumstance. And this came from a general understanding that once a group gets too large, it can be split into factions to create a voting majority to tyrannize the minority, even to their own detriment. They were skeptical of republics as well, primarily because they seemed to be fleeting in nature. However, they leaned more heavily towards the republic idea. Our country's history is a long tug of war between two theories of government: republicanism and democracy. The founding fathers and the drafters of the Constitution were always seeking the perfect balance between the democratic and the republican power structures to run our government. The American colonies inherited a local English system of governance. It had an extremely limited voting franchise, a system of representation that was skewed heavily in the favor of an educated and wealthy elite. The fact that a great deal of this legislative portion, excuse me, the fact that a great deal of the legislative portions of the American government still looked a lot like the English system, it is an indication that it had strengths that the Americans recognized and wanted to keep. The colonial elites prior to the Revolution recognized that the English were the freest and wealthiest people on the planet. The English mercantile system had a bad side effect of treating British America as a place to be exploited. Thus, British Americans were second class citizens in the British Empire. Even then, they were still more free and affluent than the rest of the world. The British, and thus the Americans who were educated as the British, expected their elected representatives to be disinterested or without interests. Thus, they should not be business owners or dependent on income from their pre government profession. The only acceptable income for a British legislature was money in a trust or income from landlording. Such disinterested income streams in America were almost impossible to come by. Disinterested British American politicians were almost non existent. The elite of British America reckoned, since that they were aware of their interests, that they had the moral fiber to avoid acting on their interest. This created a schism in American governance. There were those who were truly disinterested. You check the histories of a lot of these early founders, they would actually sell their business off or put it in some kind of blind controllership before assuming office. However, those were the minority. Those with interests who did their best not to act on them. And then there were those with interests who believed they were not acting on their own interests, but the public would disagree with their belief. Then there were those who were interested and flaunted their interests, not seeing it as an issue at all. And finally, there were those with interests who could see the problems with the politicians that had interests. And interestingly enough, a lot of these people were the wealthy Virginia planters who realized they were interested men and had to come up with some way of dealing with the fact that they were interested. And they also believed that men were not angels. So, in order to have the revolution, as a portion of the elite wanted, this required enlisting the common people. In order to entice the common people required power sharing by opening up forms of voting and representation that had not really existed previously. This resulted in the new states switching from colonial government to revolutionary governments. How big a change varied heavily from state to state, but for a large group of the population, this created a vast increase of democratization of government. Some of these revolutionary governments proved to be problematic or difficult to run once the revolution was won. Worse, the revolution in France chilled many people on the ideas of giving too much power to the people. This would result in what was actually a counter-revolution in the new United States, although our Federalist historians avoid using the term. The revolutionary state governments were reformed, and the elites re-established a government much closer to its English cousin via the Constitution. Somewhat ironically, the new Constitution was ushered in via irregular democratic conventions. Final democratic impulse to hand power back to an elite establishment. This new system opened with a voting franchise that was close to, or actually well under 25% of the population. While local and state governments had much greater democratic participation, large portions of the federal government were free of it. The judiciary, the Senate, and the whole of the executive branch were picked with a wall of separation from the people. Hamilton and his adherents did not feel that the revolution that had dismantled the Democratic Articles of Confederation in favor of the more Republican Constitution had gone far enough. Hamilton and his clique wanted to create a deeply entrenched elite and a mostly disenfranchised populace. Not so ironic, but very ignorantly, Hamilton is worshipped by modernists who claim to want greater democratization. Personally, and this is just an opinion, I think Hamilton would have fed his sheep roofies if he could have. In the end, Madison and Jefferson would work to prevent Hamiltonian excesses. Now, an odd and highly misunderstood but very illuminating idea sprang from the mind of Jefferson following this debacle. Jefferson was a firm believer of the idea of the disinterested man, and that such man being the only fit person to run government. He also recognized that few in the American government were truly disinterested, including himself. He believed that the only group that were truly disinterested in the United States was the yeoman farmer. These farmers were just a hair above subsistence, and Jefferson felt this class of people could be the future leaders of America. This accounts for the Jeffersonian obsession with farmers and maintaining agriculture as an economic base. He also recognized that the yeoman farmer was too illiterate and uneducated to be that person who could run government. Thus, he backed the idea of higher learning institutions to raise this class to be educated enough to rule. Jefferson's endeavors would bear no fruit, and the highly Republican nature of the post-revolutionary federal government had so little Democratic involvement that federal level politics would collapse into a single party. Now, over the next generation, Democratic forces would work long and hard in order to lower or eliminate property and tax requirements as a prerequisite for voting. Andrew Jackson was the culmination of this movement. that believed that an injection of democracy was one part of correcting a problem of elitism. This populist revolution had many other elements to them. However, the elements relating to democracy increased the exposure of state and local government to an increased exposure to the populace, as well as the House of Representatives at the federal level. This revolution left the presidency, the Senate, and the judiciary and the apparatuses of how political parties pick their candidates untouched, thus undemocratic. These were areas that these anti-elitist populists were happy to leave untouched. The Civil War would expand the voting franchise to black males, although the exercise of this right would be curtailed between Reconstruction and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in the 60s. The next big push for democratization would not occur until the progressive movement. Oddly, the motivation of the progressives was to restore elite control by democratizing private organization and Republican processes. The progressives believed that elite money could control the voters to vote for elite interest over that of the individual voter. To that end, progressives upended the caucus system and for the most part supplanted it with primaries. This made it difficult for the less affluent candidate with popular ideas to overcome elite-supported candidates who had the money to dominate media. Progressives would push to elect senators rather than appoint them. Instead of politicians dedicated to the multiple interests of his states, the progressively elected senator would be beholden to the elite money that paid for their campaign to get them to office. A government that has to pay off the limited interests and mechanisms of a republic has the ability to keep its scope and spending limited. An unlimited electorate has unlimited demands that require ever larger payouts to bid for their loyalty. But don't you have the right to vote? Voting is a civil right and not a natural right. Natural rights exist without codification. In the United States, certain natural rights are given a special place in the Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights to try to make doubly sure that the government doesn't try to infringe on them. Civil rights, like voting, are granted by the government. But shouldn't the more people we have voting make it more fair? Now, if you aren't a politically active person, you may not grasp the ignorance of many voters. You have no idea how many times I've talked one-on-one at political education events and met people who were lifelong voters, who voted in every election. They had issues they were absolutely passionate about, and they voted for candidates who were against their issue because they didn't actually know the position of the candidates. This is far more common than I think most of us would like to believe. There are many people who get all their information from Fox News or MSNBC. They vote. Is it fair to us who strive to get information from many sources in order to be informed that their vote is exactly equal to ours? What about people who don't even put a thought into the election all year long? I mean, think about people who are watching this video. I'm sure you're similar to me, where you're probably watching the news and trying to figure out what's going on all year long. But there's some people who are like, don't need to know anything. They walk into a voting booth and either vote by party or name recognition with no idea who most of these people are. Their one vote equals your one vote as well. How's that fair? How about states where there are ballot harvesters who are giving people gift cards to fill out a ballot? Yes, their one vote also equals yours. So in the comment section below, how do you feel on this whole democracy versus republic debate? Is this just an example of meaning of words kind of drifting over time and we shouldn't really care about it? Or Is the meaning of democracy versus republic important enough that basically we should be beating people over the head because of the definition? Interested to hear what you think on that? Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please check out my other titles. Consider subscribing. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.